Well, I'm an historian of philosophy, as I say, not a philosopher, but one of the things I'm going to try and persuade you of this evening is that in the case of political philosophy, that gap is not actually a very large one. There's a Nietzschean thought hovering here, which is that, as he says in The Genealogy of Morality, some concepts have histories, and if a concept has a history, then it's not going to have an agreed definition. And so your approach to the understanding of that concept will actually have to be historical, and will need to focus on the investigation of the changing terminology in which the concept is expressed. Now, a number of our political concepts are clearly of that character, and perhaps the central concept of our political lexicon is the state, and it's unquestionable that since the early modern period, that concept has been subjected to continual contestation and debate. So in talking about the history of the concept, we're talking about those very contestations about how to understand it. And so the two come together. So that's the sort of methodological thought that underlies what I'll try and say this evening. And then the first historical thought is that I think it would be completely uncontentious to say that in the Anglophone tradition, the first systematic analysis of how to think about this concept, expressed in the terminology that we would now use of state, state power, statehood, and so forth, is the work of Thomas Hobbes. But I want to use Hobbes and his view about the state to try to think about the concept itself more generally, and to think about how it might be understood and how it has been understood. Now, from having no lectern, we've now got 3, but I'm very happy with this one. Thank you very much. Very resourceful, most grateful. Very good.
Plenty of choice.
I might just move between them. Now, I want to start not with Hobbes or with the early modern period when this concept is philosophically formed for the first time, but by thinking about the concept of the state and how we now generally think about it. And here I hope also to be completely uncontentious, because it seems to me that 2 general claims about the concept have come to be very widely accepted in current discourse. One is that when we refer to the state, what we're really talking about is simply the institutions and coercive apparatus of political power, of government. The most celebrated of these completely empirical formulations of how to think about the state is undoubtedly that of Max Weber, describing it, as you know, or rather I might say defining it, as you know, as the monopolist of legitimate power over some designated territory. And by now that way of thinking, that purely empirical way of thinking about the state, is so widely accepted that I think if you reflect for a moment on how you see the terminology used in every newspaper of the day now, the terms state and government are in common parlance synonyms. The other claim about the state that's come to be widely agreed, first being to talk about the state is to talk about the apparatus of government, I mean, that's what we're talking about, is that a number of economic and political developments have undermined and at the same time tended to discredit the power of the state. Just a word first about the undermining of state sovereignty in our time. Perhaps the most obvious cause of that has been the rise of multinational corporations, of international economic reach. And of course they, with the capacity to control terms of investment and employment, are visibly able to coerce states into accommodating their designs, even when those designs are out of line with the policies of those states. So they have greater power, especially in the developing world, than most states. And at the same time, of course, this is obvious, the developing world has witnessed the rise of international legal institutions which claim to have a power to supervene upon the sovereignty of states. I mean, the international courts, the International Court of Justice is the original and most important example, but there are many. So there's one part of the story, but as well as a devaluing of sovereignty, there's been a discrediting of it, has there not, with the increasing prevalence of neoliberal claims about how the use of state power should not be a means to shape a society. State power is bad, it's the monopolistic enemy of competition and enterprise, and the power of the market is instead good for shaping society. It's the enabling friend of innovation and enterprise and so on. Now, those two thoughts together have persuaded a number of commentators that the power of the state is now in terminal decline. And Foucault, as you know, famously draws the moral in one of his very late interviews that we should learn to cut off the head of the monarch in political philosophy as well as in politics. That's to say, to liberate ourselves from the illusion that it still makes sense to talk about sovereign states. A number of international theorists now talk about the death of the state, and in a recent article on all of these developments, Professor Frank Ankersmit has concluded, let me just quote because he's an eminent authority, now for the first time in more than half a millennium, the state is on the way out. Okay, I hope that's all uncontentious. Two ways of thinking about the state which are prevalent in our time. First, that to speak about the state is simply to speak about an apparatus of government, and secondly, to speak about it is to speak about an apparatus whose day is coming to an end. Okay, what are we to think about those judgments? That's going to be the theme of the remainder of this lecture. So first, what about the judgment that the state is, in Ankersmit's phrase, on the way out? I mean, this is not at all uncontentious, especially as neoliberalism is so much the story of political theory at the moment. But I think here I can nevertheless be brief, because what strikes me most of all about that contention is how much out of line it is with our everyday experience. I mean, of course it's undeniable that states have forfeited many of the traditional attributes of sovereignty, and also it's undeniable that, especially in the European Union, sovereignty has attached to itself to larger associations than states. But to make the obvious point that states are no longer sovereign in the traditional Westphalian sense is hardly the same, parce Foucault, as deconstructing the concept. And that leads me to want to say something which I mean, I fear, but also I hope, is going to seem very obvious. It's this. If you look at international affairs, it's surely not to be doubted that the principal actors on the international stage are nation states. The idea of humanitarian intervention has yet to be deployed in a way that challenges any major state, and nor will it be so. It will not challenge Russia or China or America or the European Union. Furthermore, within their terrains, nation states remain incomparably the most important political actors. I mean, how can this be doubted? They're very aggressive at the moment, patrolling their boundaries with a shocking degree of exclusiveness and maintaining an equally shocking level of surveillance over their own citizens without their permission. They're also very interventionist, and in the face of collapsing banking systems, they even step forward as lenders of last resort. Who else was going to do that? And to a greater degree than I think it's currently fashionable to suppose, due to their major infrastructures, they facilitate markets. I mean, markets would be largely impotent without the infrastructures of states. And meanwhile, they continue to do things which no other agency in the world does all of these things. They print money, they impose taxes, they enforce contracts, they subsidize our cultural lives, they provide health and welfare state services, and they legislate with an unprecedented degree of complexity. All of that is absolutely obvious. So what is all this stuff about the death of the state? It's just neoliberal ideology. We must not allow ourselves to be deceived into forgetting all these obvious facts by the way that right-wing governments talk. On the way out, I mean, that's just inattentive from a political philosopher. Well, that's as much as I want to say about the death of the state. I mean, the states are in an extraordinarily powerful shape at the moment, enough of a powerful shape to be threatening the European Union. And that's what we should be worrying about, not that they've died. Okay, I want to turn now to the other claim. This is far more serious for me, to the other claim I began by isolating, that when we talk about the state, we're talking about an apparatus of and institutions of government. That state and government, these are synonyms. I mean, that is, of course, common parlance. But what most strikes me here is not, we can't challenge common parlance. It's extraordinarily important that when we talk about the state, we just mean government. But what strikes me here is what an extraordinarily strong contrast there is between that way of thinking about the state and the way in which the concept was understood when it first became the central noun, as Cliff Geertz says, the master noun of our political discourse, when it first became that master noun. Because when that happened, which I would say is a development recognisably of the late 17th century, principally in the work of Hobbes, who is the great pioneer here, but also in the work of a number of continental European followers, especially Pufendorf and then Wolff and Thomasius and right through to the Hegelian theory of the state, and which also solidified in other areas of Europe in the Enlightenment, in France most obviously with Vattel and Rousseau, and in England with Blackstone. It's an important discourse about the state that emerges in that two generations. But if you think of any of those writers whom I've now quoted, any of them, when they speak about the state, or l'État, or der Staat, the basic reason they have for foregrounding that concept is to try to mark a categorical distinction between states and governments. That's the whole point. And the whole point for them is that so far from being able to equate states with governments, the state is seen as the name of a distinct person, separate, that is, at once from the person of the ruler and from the persons of the ruled. So what I want to talk about this evening is this idea of state personality, because we've completely lost it in current discourse. And the question is, have we lost something of value? Well, to see if we have, I need to turn to the first classic formulation, and I think it's not contentious to say that that is in the philosophy of Hobbes, and especially in his treatise called Leviathan, first published in 1651, in which he informs us at the outset, and I'm quoting, that in putting forward, he says, his theory of public power, I shall be speaking not of the men, but in the abstract about the nature of the commonwealth or state. Now, Hobbes historically is, of course, a defender in the course of the English Revolution of the 17th century of absolute sovereignty against the republicanism of the age. But, in spite of those political allegiances, he never speaks in the manner common to absolutist writers of the early modern period of any kind of reverence which is owed to sovereigns, sovereigns as the Lord's anointed or sovereigns as directly given to us by God. He never talks like that. Although most absolutists, if you think of French absolutism of the period, they all think in these very theologico-political terms. Hobbes doesn't because of two fundamental and connected features of his thinking about the holders of sovereign power. And the first is that all lawful sovereigns, including absolute monarchs, can never be said to have any status higher than that of an authorized representative. So he doesn't speak of sovereigns, he only ever speaks of sovereign representatives. And the second thought is that whether a sovereign representative is a monarch or an assembly of people, Hobbes doesn't mind, you can have democracy or monarchy. He thinks it's wiser to have monarchy, but democracy is also a form of state power. The holders of power have a number of specific duties attached to their office which they must and have an obligation to discharge. Hobbes assumes that you would never submit to sovereign power unless you could see that there would be advantage over the way of life that you would lead in conditions of natural liberty. But if that is so, then the sovereign to whom you've submitted must have incurred corresponding obligations. I quote, in such a way as to produce the peace and security of the people, and to do so by way of conducting government in a manner agreeable to the common good. There's the duty of the sovereign representative. Now, it is, of course, true that because the sovereign representative is absolute, you cannot remove such, you have no right to remove such a representative. You can, of course, do it. You have no right to do it if he fails in discharging those duties. But if a sovereign fails to act for the common good, he is guilty under the law of nature, and this is iniquitous, Hobbes says. And if he fails to protect, then he is no longer sovereign. You only have a sovereign in order to have protection. Another way of putting it, far more dramatically, is that if he is a sovereign and fails to protect, you are no longer politically obliged. Political obligation is at that moment at an end. So there's a very strong sense of the duties of representatives attached to this theory of sovereignty. So they're just representatives. All right, that makes the key question of this theory: who do they represent? Sovereigns are just representatives. Who do they represent? And the answer isn't obvious, and to come to the answer is to come to the heart of this theory of the state. Now, to see how Hobbes comes to his answer to the question, who does a sovereign represent, you have to know about his distinctive understanding of the political covenant. As he explains, when such a covenant is enacted, it's an as-if way of thinking. It's as if everybody agrees with everyone else, that some particular person, that's some man or woman or some assembly, shall have the right to speak and act in their name. So the formula in which the covenant is introduced in the Leviathan is expressed, I quote, as, "I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man or to this assembly, on this condition that thou give up thy right to him and authorize all his actions in like manner." Now, in the previous chapter, that's chapter 17 and chapter 16, Hobbes has just told you what it means to authorize a representative. Representatives are classified by Hobbes as what he calls artificial persons. And he says, I quote, that of such persons artificial, some have their words and actions owned by those whom they represent. And then the person is the actor. And he that owneth his words and actions is the author, in which case the actor acteth by authority. So you've got author, authority. Very important piece of etymology there. So what's Hobbes saying there? He's saying that if you authorize your own representation, you must be willing to regard yourself as the owner of the actions that are done by your representative. And the reason is that by your act of authorization, you have granted them authority to act in your name. So you must be prepared to take responsibility for those actions as your own. That's what he means by saying you've got to own the action. It's like owning a piece of property, as he says. You own a piece of property, you own an action. What does it mean? It means it is your own. You must, as we still say, own up. You are responsible. So notice underlying this, very contentious in contemporary philosophy, of course, is the claim that an attributed action is a species of action. Attributed actions, which you do not yourself perform, but which you're responsible for, are actions of yours because you must own them. All right, there's the analysis of authorization, and that brings Hobbes to his central claim about the implications of covenanting. And that is that if you agree to authorize your representation by the artificial person of a sovereign, artificial person just means they've taken on a role, it's an artifice, the artificial person of the sovereign, then this act on the part of each one of us of agreeing who shall represent us and authorizing that representation at the same time transforms us from a multitude into one. Well, how have we become one? Well, because we are united by a common agreement, which is to live in subjection to a particular representative, and therefore by the fact that we now have a determining will, one will, which is our will, because we own the actions of the representative who actually acts. And so his actions count as those of us all. But that's to say that by this act of authorizing representation, we have transformed ourselves into one person. Here's Hobbes' summary. A multitude of men are made one person when they are by one man or one person represented. For the effect is to produce a real unity of them all in one and the same person, made by covenant of every man with every man. So you see, the act of covenanting, which is the absolute core of this philosophy of the state, engenders two persons who had no previous existence in our natural condition of liberty. One is the artificial person to whom we grant authority to speak and act in our name, and we know the name of that person, that is the sovereign. And the other is what Hobbes calls the person by fiction, whom we bring into being when we acquire a single will and a single voice by way of having authorized someone to represent us. And the name of that person, Hobbes says, in an epoch-making moment, is the state. I quote, "The multitude, so united in one person, is called a commonwealth or state." Now, the state you've now just instituted is, as Hobbes says, a mortal God. And we owe, under the immortal God, to this mortal God, our peace and our defense. And just as the immortal God is three persons, so the mortal God of the state is also three persons, or rather three types of person. Natural persons, each one of us. Natural person in Hobbes just means a sane adult, able to take responsibility for their actions. An artificial person, which is the name of a natural person playing a role, i.e., in this case, the role of the sovereign. And a fictive person, the name of the person whom the sovereign represents, and that is the state. So there is the answer to the question. Whom, when we authorize the sovereign, does the sovereign represent? He does not represent us. He can't, because we're plural. He can only represent a person. But what he represents is our person. He represents us as one person. And the name of us as one person is the state. So the answer to the question, who does the sovereign represent, is the sovereign represents the state. And Hobbes, therefore, is able to define the state. I quote, "The state is one person, of whose acts a great multitude, by mutual covenants, have made every one themselves the author, while the sovereign is the man or assembly that bears or carries the person of the state." So Hobbes gives the state a name of its own. He calls it Leviathan. And he goes on to describe this person in rather detailed terms. He's very interested in how this person can live a healthy life. And he's very interested in the fragility of the health of this person, and has a complete chapter, long chapter, chapter 29, on the diseases of this person, the diseases of the state, of the body politic, and how the body politic can die. Civil war is the death of this person. He also stresses that sovereigns are just natural persons in a role. They come and go. The multitude, they are born and die all the time. They change every day. But the person of the state is immortal. It endures. And it must endure beyond the life of any imaginable subjects. He doesn't think it is immortal, of course, and he thinks that he's witnessed the death of the state in his own time because he lived through a civil war, which is the death of the state because there's no sovereign. There's dispute over who is sovereign. But he insists that the aim of founding a state, I quote, is to make it live as long as mankind, establishing a system of perpetual security that can be bequeathed by us to our remote prosperity, and to create an artificial eternity of life. Okay, so that's what you've done. You've created this fictional person represented by a sovereign. Now, it is only a fiction, this person, but it would be a huge mistake to suppose that this fiction is not a mighty force in the real world, because that would be to forget what lies at the heart of this theory, this view about attributed actions being actions. Once you grasp the concept of an attributed action, it's easy to see, Hobbes points out, how the purely fictional person of the state is nevertheless capable of being a person of unsurpassable power and might. When the members of a multitude covenant to institute a sovereign, they allocate him the fullest possible powers to act for the common good. But the sovereign, remember, is just the representative of the state. Whatever actions the sovereign performs in his or her official capacity are acts of state, as we still say. So the true possessor of sovereignty is not the sovereign. The sovereign is just a representative. The true possessor of sovereignty is the state. I quote, "It is the commonwealth or state which prescribes and commandeth the observation of those rules which we call laws, so that the name of the person commanding is persona civitatis, the person of the state." Now there's Hobbes' way of thinking about public power, but it's been met with the very obvious objection that the state is a fiction and yet the state is a sovereign power. But how can a fiction declare war? How can a sovereign fiction put you in jail? How can fictions have any power? Well, that really is the question, and Hobbes' response is, yes, that looks like a very grave problem for this type of theory, but Hobbes' claim is if you think that's a problem, you've got a problem. And the problem you've got is a very common problem in political philosophy, which is that you don't understand the concept of representation. And he would be quite clear that we don't understand the concept of representation now. Let me talk about that, because this really is the point of this theory. It's perfectly true that we have inherited from antiquity two different metaphors for thinking about representation. One draws on the arts of painting and sculpture and thinks of representation. The Latin verb is representare. That representation is the representing of something absent as if it is present. The classic text on this, as I'm sure you know, is embedded in Pliny's great Historia Naturalis. Books 34 and 35 are a treatise on painting and sculpture. In fact, one of the classical statements of classical aesthetics. The world is sent to present itself to us, and in painting and sculpture we attempt to represent the world. And Pliny's verb is always representare. Pliny gives a wonderful example, which you perhaps know, which is of a painting competition which was won by the painter Zeuxis. Zeuxis painted a pair of curtains. And when the judges appeared, the judge said, "Could you part the curtains, please, to see what you have painted?" That's how he won the competition. Because he represented a pair of curtains so exactly that they appeared not to be an illusion. So the essence of representation in this analysis is providing the best possible likeness, representing. And that gets applied in the early modern period and subsequently to the idea of political representation, the representation of the body of the people. Among the radical writers of the English Revolution to whom Hobbes is responding, this was the understanding of representation that was put forward, and that remained so for a very long time. In English voting systems, each section of the body politic, called the counties, returned 2 members of Parliament regardless of their population. This remains true under the American Constitution to this day. The Senate of America is elected in that way. The reasoning is that these counties or these states in the United States form the limbs of the body politic, so that a proper representation of the body of the people must represent each of those elements equally. So how does Hobbes reply? He replies by saying, look, you've got the wrong metaphor. That just is not the right metaphor thinking about representation at all. And what he does is to produce a different image from antiquity, which draws not on the art of painting, but on the theatrical arts. And instead of using the verb representare, we've inherited 2 verbs from Latin in thinking about political representation, representare and gerere personam. Gerere personam is the theatrical phrase which Cicero loves to use, which means to play someone else's role. And I quote Hobbes on Cicero, "From the theatre," as Hobbes says, quoting Cicero, "the metaphor has been transferred to the law courts and comes to be the act of speaking in the name of a client." So what that shows, Hobbes wants you to understand, is that what it means for you to be validly represented is just like being in a theatre or a court of law. So there's Hobbes's crucial move. Political representation, he wants to say, is nothing more than authorizing someone to play your role. That's to say, to speak in your name, to act in your name. Of course, it's special in the theatre, because until I play the part of Hamlet, then it's just words on the page. I bring him to life by speaking those words. Analogously, in the court of law, the judge says, "Who represents you?" Of course, you can say, certainly in English law, "I represent myself," in which case the judge will say, "Well, I wouldn't do that if I were you." But that is possible. But then usually you would point to your attorney and say, "This person represents me." Doesn't mean he resembles you. Doesn't have to look like you. That's the huge mistake. Notice that huge implication. It's absurd to suppose that representation is anything to do with producing likenesses. When you appoint an advocate, if you're a man, you can appoint a woman. If you're a woman, you can appoint a man. Anyone can represent anyone. That's the crucial claim. They just have to be authorized. Now, we've actually ceased believing that, but Hobbes thinks that's where we've gone wrong. Notice also, here's the crucial point. If authorization is a sufficient condition of representation, then anyone can represent not merely anyone else, but anything, as Hobbes says. So you can represent a thing. Hobbes gives us an example, the gods of the heathen, in his chapter on representation. The gods of the heathen did not exist. They were mere figments of the brain, Hobbes says. But in ancient Rome, they nevertheless held extensive property, which they bought and sold. So here is the tough question from the theory of representation. How can you sell a house if you don't exist? Well, Hobbes says, don't worry about that. That's not a problem. The Roman state authorized priests to act as representatives of the gods, who were therefore able to speak in court as representatives of the gods and in their name, and therefore to perform perfectly valid transactions. So in the Roman court of law, the judge says, "Who represents Jupiter?" Now, Jupiter doesn't exist, but that's a perfectly valid legal question. And a priest stands up and says, "I represent Jupiter. We're selling his statue." So Hobbes says, now you can see how purely fictional persons can have enormous power, and how the state, which is just a fiction, can nevertheless declare war and put you in jail. It is because authorization is a sufficient condition of representation. So if you've authorized a sovereign, the sovereign speaks in the name of the state, but the action is attributed to the state, and the state acts. The state declares war. The state puts you in jail. So there is Hobbes's theory of the state. And it's the first unambiguous theory of state personality in Western political philosophy. Well, I hope that theory is clear. It's certainly intricate, but I hope it's clear, and it's important that it should be because it's fantastically influential for a time. There's a big irony here, which is that the English had no use for Hobbes. Absolutism was out of the window with the success of the Whigs in the English Revolution, in the 1688 Revolution. But in continental Europe, and especially in Germany and later in France, this theory of state personality is pervasive. It comes to exercise an enormous influence. And the general view has been that the philosopher through whom that influence actually came to be exercised was not so much Hobbes as Samuel Pufendorf in his great treatise De Jura Naturae of 1672. So it's especially amongst German commentators, I mean notably von Geerke originally, and then of course Carl Schmitt, that Pufendorf came to be seen as the great disciple of Hobbes. As Schmitt says, he was the man who made Hobbes victorious in continental Europe. That's to say, as a theorist of the state. Now that view is, I think, partly correct. Pufendorf certainly agrees. I quote him. I'm quoting him in the 18th century English translation, that Mr. Hobbes has now given us a draft of a civil state. He also agrees with Hobbes that the state is brought into existence, I quote, when a number of natural persons are so united together that what they will or act by virtue of that union is esteemed the work of a single person. He further agrees that the name of that person is the state, and he consequently agrees with Hobbes's fundamental contention that the state is the seat of sovereignty. Finally, he also endorses, but also develops, Hobbes' account of why it is essential to a satisfactory analysis of public power to think of the state not merely as a person distinct from rulers and rules, as a separate person, but also as having artificial eternity of life. He loves that phrase, Pufendorf, that the state indeed has artificial eternity of life. One reason why it must have, Pufendorf suggests, is the final chapter of his analysis of the state, is if you take a case like public debt. But the main reason why it has to have artificial eternity of life is that this generates a theory of political obligation. And that is a really crucial point common to Hobbes and to Pufendorf. That the reason for forming the union which grants the sovereign representation of the state is to produce the common good, and above all to produce the protection of the people. Salus populi, suprema lex is what Pufendorf continually cites. So all of that is in common with Hobbes. That is true. However, it seems to me that by stressing what Pufendorf takes from Hobbes, this German historiographical tradition, which has been very influential, has, I think, ironically failed to see something very original in Pufendorf's thinking about the state, which in turn was far more influential than anything that Hobbes had said. I just want to add this addendum, therefore, about Pufendorf's theory. First of all, Pufendorf gives a much fuller characterization than Hobbes does of these two worlds that we inhabit. We inhabit a world of nature with natural objects in it, but we also inhabit an artificial world which we've created for ourselves, which is the world of civil association, and that contains moral objects. Now, the most important of these moral objects are moral persons, because they constitute the substance of this moral world in which we also live. We live in the world of nature, but we live in the world of morality. And the world of morality has its own substances, just as does the world of nature. So these moral persons are the names of the roles, the personae that we have, the roles we play in civil association. I quote Pufendorf, "I can, at one and the same time, sustain several persons together, bear various persons, have various personae. I am a householder, I am a husband, I am a senator, I am an advocate, I am a counsellor at court." And all of these are the names of my personae. So these personae are moral personae because, being a husband or a counsellor or a householder, these have duties attached to them, and an obligation to discharge those duties if you are to fulfill the being of that persona. So there's much fuller account of that notion of having personae. He would say we all have many personae. As Cicero would say, if you tell me all your personae, all the roles that you have, that's your person. So that's an account of personal identity. But far more important for Pufendorf is he thinks that Hobbes has skidded off the rails in his analysis of personhood, and hence in his understanding of the state. Because what Pufendorf, as you can already see, cannot tolerate is the thought that a thing could have personhood. Why is that? Because things can't have moral properties. They have substance, of course, but they don't have moral substance. So the gods of the heathen have no substance at all. So how can they have personhood? So notice that what Pufendorf has given up is the idea of the persona ficta. The state is not the name of a persona ficta for Pufendorf. He introduces a different term. My goodness, this is extraordinarily influential. It's not a persona ficta, it's a persona moralis. It's a moral person. It is what he calls a compound moral person. So I think that what we should say is that what emerged in early modern philosophy of politics is two rival theories of the state. One is the theory of pure fictionality, and the other is that the state is not a fictional person, it is a moral person. It's the latter view that has the great influence. You find it in Thomasius and Wolff, you find it in Kant, of course, above all, you find it in Hegel, in the idea of the Rechtsstaat. But you find it just as clearly in the French tradition, in Vattel's insistence that the state is personne morale, which is picked up in Rousseau's Contrat social, where l'État is always referred to as a personne morale. And they are explicitly here, especially in Vattel and Rousseau, although of course they are sort of Hobbesians, contesting what Hobbes says. I quote Vattel, "The state, l'État, c'est une personne compounded," I'm now translating obviously, "out of the understanding and the will of each subject." Not just the will, but the understanding. So that the state is a moral person which has an understanding as well as a will peculiar to itself. Vattel is particularly important. I mean, obviously Rousseau's is the great analysis of moral personality in the Enlightenment, but Vattel is probably even more influential because of his insistence that this is what explains the relations between states. They are relations between moral persons. That's what international relations is all about, relations of moral persons. So you cannot have a theory of international relations in Vattel's very influential account in the absence of a theory of state personality, because, as he says, all alliances are alliances between persons, and they must be persons of the state, because otherwise they don't have any continuing authority. Okay, final thought is that if we're now in the heart of the Enlightenment, as we are, talking about the German and the French tradition, Hobbes' story at last comes to England, and it comes to England above all in the most influential of the English common law commentators, Sir William Blackstone, in the Commentaries on the Laws of England, where he begins with a philosophical disquisition on the origins of the state. And it's completely Hobbesian. That's to say, he sees a world of nature, which is a multitude of individual people. He sees that they cannot institute a single will except by a covenant. He sees the covenant as creating the person of the state, and sovereignty as the representation of that person. So I think you could say, without it being an exaggeration, that by that stage in Enlightenment thought, the idea of the state has become very generally accepted, the idea of the person of the state. And the only debate is whether it's a purely fictive person or must be a moral person. Well, I want to end this lecture. I've got 5 minutes more. I think we started after the hour, didn't we? So have I got 5 minutes more? I want to end by raising two questions. One is that at the end of the 18th century, the Anglophone tradition, not just the English, but the Anglophone tradition, skidded off in a completely different direction. As a result of which, the idea of state personality came to be seen as completely foreign to Anglophone political philosophy, and indeed, except for a brief neo-Hegelian revival at the end of the 19th century, it has effectively disappeared. Now, I just want to ask two questions about the Anglophone tradition then over this period. One is, why did it disappear? And the other is, did we lose anything that matters? So let me just end by raising very briefly those two questions. Why did it disappear? I think most of the answer is to be found in the enormous influence from the late 18th century onwards in Anglophone thought of utilitarianism as a moral and political philosophy. Jeremy Bentham's first work is The Fragment of Government, 1776, which, as you know, entirely consists of a vituperative attack on exactly the sections of Blackstone that I have just cited. I quote Bentham, "The season of fictions is over. The time has come to ground legal arguments on facts about real individuals, and especially on the capacity of individuals for experiencing, in relation to political power, the pain of restraint and the pleasure of liberty." So, confronted with Blackstone's Hobbesian stuff about the state of nature, freedom, the covenant, the creation of a fictive person, that person being represented, the name of that person being the state. Bentham doesn't say that that's mistaken. I quote him again, "These entire sections are completely meaningless. They are a mere sequence of fictions. But law must get rid of fictions. It's got to be about pleasure pain." And that is remarkably influential. And of course, that purported demystification of the state is the origin of the idea that if we're talking about, well, what could we mean if we're talking about the state, except those who have charge of an apparatus of government? And that's what you find in the whole of utilitarian classical jurisprudence, of which the classic instance would be John Austin's Province of Jurisprudence Determined of 1832. I quote, "My own understanding of the state is that the term simply denotes the individual person or the body of individual persons who are given the supreme power in any independent political society." So there, in brief outline, I could certainly talk more about that if you wished in discussion, but there is a very powerful legal theoretical ideology which has no use for fictions, and above all the supreme fiction, the state. So finally, the other question I'd like to end with is, has anything of value been lost in Anglophone, and now far more generally, in European political speculation as a result of giving up the idea of state personality? Well, Carl Schmitt became celebrated, infamous, for saying, yes, that has been the gravest loss in modern political philosophy. And his extraordinary book about the state person, as he calls it, the state person in Hobbes' Leviathan, is that is the way to think about the state, and we've lost it. And so we've lost what really matters. And the reason that it matters, according to Schmitt, is, of course, as I'm sure you know, that you have to have a union under some will which not only acts as a sovereign power, but has the power to determine the exception, to determine the emergency. And that you have to recognize that that is the power of the state, and that it must be obeyed as long as it protects you. Well, there is Schmitt's Hobbesianism. That is one of Hobbes' arguments, as it's one of Pufendorf's arguments. But if I think back to the whole tradition that I've talked about, and if you remember what I said about Hobbes and Pufendorf and Vattel, that's not what they really want you to understand matters about the state. Oh no. They have three further things that they really want you to think about, and I want to end with them. One is this idea that you've got to be able to make sense of the fact that some governmental actions have the intended effect of binding not merely the citizens now, but their remote posterity, as Hobbes says. And as we've seen, one obvious example, Pufendorf takes it, and many later legal theorists took it. Maitland has a celebrated essay on it, is the phenomenon of what's come to be called sovereign debt. Of course, that's a stupid thing to call it. It's state debt. We should call it state debt, the debts of states. Who is the debtor? Well, you can hardly answer the government. Governments come and go, but that debt doesn't come and go. And I mean, it'd be wonderful if it did. But that debt is still there. The only way to make sense of the question, who is the debtor, Pufendorf wants you to understand, is to say it must be a person with an artificial eternity of life. Can't be any other person. And there's only one such person in our politics. Don't get rid of it. Secondly, they want you to see that there's analogously the question of the relation of remote posterity in relation to other governments. And there's the point that Vattel keeps making. He has this category which he calls real treaties. A real treaty is not just a sticking plaster. A real treaty is a relationship of moral persons which is designed to endure as long as those persons. So the signatories cannot be governments. It will have to be understood that the signatories are artificially eternal and therefore must be states. That's the second thought. The third, and for these writers much the most important point, is if and only if you make a categorical distinction between states and governments, can you use the idea of the state to generate what you really want, which is a theory of the limits of political obligation. That's for them the really crucial point. And how does that work? Well, through, you remember, Pufendorf's mantra, let the people's safety be the supreme law. Salus populi suprema lex. So for these philosophers, the basic reason for categorically distinguishing state from government is that it is a means of holding governments to account to ask, are they satisfying their obligations to the person of the state? Now, it's commonly been said, especially in recent liberal political philosophy, that sounds a bit sinister. But the belief that what I've just said is sinister is just a misunderstanding of the theory that I've been laying out, and it turns out to be quite a difficult theory to get across in contemporary political philosophy. But according to the theory I've laid out, to say that the name of the state is the name of a distinct person is just a way of referring to us. That's to say, a body of citizens who have authorized their representation. So when we speak about the interests of the state, that is equivalent to speaking about anything that we could judge to be a public interest. Now, notoriously, it's hard to make sense of the notion of the common good in societies which are multicultural. But these writers would nevertheless think that you could give a very robust sense of the common good, that there are interests that all citizens have. For example, an interest, Hobbes would say, in being educated, an interest in being given welfare to look after them when they can't look after themselves, an interest in being defended. If we were to insist that all of those interests were served, we would have an extraordinarily robust theory of the democratic state. But of course, that's what we now don't have, because our ruling elites, most shamelessly in the United Kingdom and the United States, have seized and manipulated the apparatus of the state for their own purposes, and are continuing to do so. We don't have the moral vocabulary with which to contest that, but we do, because it is the vocabulary of the state, which leads me to wonder if our abandonment of that vocabulary may not have been a very serious mistake. Thank you very much.